What's happening, sales players? It's Jesse, and I'm putting together a quick video today on a topic that I've been getting a lot of questions about from members of the coaching community here on Slack and from others who I've had a lot of conversations with over the last couple of weeks. And that is on how you can get the most out of your meeting recording tool. It might sound like a pretty obvious topic, but we're going to get into some very specific tips. I've got 5 tips for you today for improving and getting the most out of your meeting recording tool. And let me jump to the next slide here so you can see an example of what I'm talking about. If you're listening, I'll read off some of these logos. You probably already have some form of meeting recording tool in your tech stack as a seller or as a BDR even. And the main ones, the ones you hear about the most, are going to be Gong, Chorus, and then Clary. Those are more geared towards larger teams that have, lots of sellers, lots of sales reps, larger teams that want to capture a lot of data. I've used all these tools, by the way. So everything you see here on the screen is a tool that I have personally used for sales meetings. And from my perspective, they functionally do essentially the same thing. However, you are going to get more out of something like Gong or Chorus, where they're going to capture a lot of insights. Clary is also really great for tying it back to your specific deals and the deals on your team's in your team's pipeline. So there's some nuances, there's some differences between each of these. Obviously, people in my comment section are going to say that I can't compare Gong to something like Firefly's AI. But you might have something like Gong, Chorus, Firefly's AI, Clary. I have right here in the center of the screen Fathom, which is a partner to the Sales Players podcast. So if you don't have a tool already, if you're not using one of these, go check out Fathom. It's free, and it's actually a really incredible tool for getting started. Again, it's not going to be quite the same thing as Gong, where it's got this just super robust metrics and analytics side of it, or a coaching aspect to it, but it's very good at summarizing your meetings and shipping off that summary to both parties if you configure it that way. So highly recommend. They're a partner to the show. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to go get set up with Fathom for free. So these are some examples of the tools. You probably already have one of these in your stack. If you don't, go get one or get out of that company, because they should absolutely be investing in this type of product. This is really, this type of technology is a game changer. It's probably one of the most revolutionary things that's happened to selling since, the phone or Sales Navigator or something like that, right? It's pretty important and kind of a game changer. Early on in my career, you could record calls, but not really well. You might record them on your meeting bridge. So before Zoom was really popular, there was like a company called Join.me, and there was like Citrix. I don't even remember what it was called. But you could, I guess, record, but all it was just a recording. You couldn't get transcriptions. There wasn't coaching insights. There wasn't data points. They didn't feed you a digest of important topics that were covered. They didn't break the call into sections. That's some of the cool things you can do with some of these tools. And if you haven't played around in a Gong or a Chorus, you can really get some specific insights about your particular conversations that you're having, and you can break your sales calls into sections, right? Like intros, the presentation section, the talking about pricing section, or the talking about next steps section. Those are all really cool features of some of these. And I've found it's been a game changer for me in my deal management to be able to go back and actually reference calls that I've done with my prospects, so that I can come better prepared to the next conversation, so that I can speak intelligently about the challenges that they're encountering in their business and map those challenges back to the solutions that I can solve for with my product. So let's get into some specific tips here. Again, hopefully you're using one of these tools. I kind of already covered this, but sales meeting recordings are solid gold, especially for enterprise or consultative type sales when you're working with multiple stakeholders. Anytime there's even a little bit of a complexity in a deal cycle, you want to be able to have your meetings recorded and have some insights and transcripts and those sorts of things. Furthermore, these tools can be really great for your own development. What I've found using some of these tools, especially something like a Gong, where there's tons of insights into you specifically as a seller. And some examples of that I'll get into here in a second, but just off the top of my head, there's like an insight on how long it takes you to respond to someone after they're done talking, or how long it takes you to say, specific buzzwords or things like that, or how you approach certain things. I know they can be trained with AI and you can pick up competitor insights and all kinds of interesting things, but these are really an important part of doing consultative selling. And so if you are in an enterprise or strategic selling role, or even a mid-market selling role where you've got multiple stakeholders, multiple decision makers, and different parties that have to evaluate something before they purchase, you're going to want to make sure you're recording your meetings, and these tips are going to be pretty helpful for you. So let's get into it. Tip number 1, always go back and listen to your discovery, demo, pricing calls, proposal review calls, touch base calls, et cetera, right? This one might seem pretty obvious, but you'd actually be surprised that I work with a lot of people. I've met a lot of people that don't ever go back and listen to their call recordings. And not only listening to them, but also just checking out the transcripts or getting the AI summary. Most of these products will generate a summary of the call with next steps or with action items. Pretty cool. And I've found most of them to be pretty accurate in terms of, got it right. That is the next step in the process. And that is what I need to deliver. And that's what so-and-so prospect needs to deliver, right? So go back and listen to them. Go back and read the transcripts, search the transcripts, use these as part of your preparation for the next step in your sales process. And I'll give you a specific example. I'm working on preparing a demo for a company this week. And before I approached my counterpart on the technical side who's going to be delivering the demo, I went back and re-listened to the entire 40-minute discovery conversation that I had with the prospect around the very specific things that they were looking for in the business, specific criteria. She had certain things that she wanted to make sure we covered off on in the demo. So it was going back, searching the transcript, re-listening to the call, and being able to then also kind of ingest some of her terminology that she was using, internal names and nomenclature and things like that. A lot of times your prospects will actually name the projects they're working on. They might call the project something like Operation XYZ. And if you can come back later in the sales cycle and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, I'm trying to help you with Operation XYZ. I know that's what you guys call this project internally. I'm trying to help with Operation XYZ. That'll lend a lot of credibility to your listening skills and your ability to be a consultative or solutions-oriented seller. So the first tip is always go back and listen and really block time on your calendar and make a point to go do this and review the transcripts and really dig into, because here's the thing, and I'll tangent here for a second. These discovery calls, they happen so quick. They're 30, maybe 60 minutes at most. And it's so hard to retain everything that you're hearing. A lot of times you'll show up to these calls, you might ask a couple of really good discovery questions, and then the prospect starts to unload all their challenges. And it's really hard in the moment to ingest all of that information and make it actionable later on. And sure, you can take notes on paper, but this I've found is much more effective because you can focus on the conversation and being present, and then, commit to going back after the call to re-listen to it, review everything that you learned. Then you can make some notes, and then you can use some of the findings in your next conversation with the prospect. So that's tip 1. Go and listen to the calls, make a habit out of doing it, block time on your calendar, get into a routine of once you've had a discovery or a demo or a pricing call or some kind of touch base call, go back and re-listen to that recording. So tip number 2 is to actually send the meeting recording link as part of your follow-up. So when I follow up with my prospects, I actually will send a link to the meeting recording. Even better is I actually go in and create an edited version. Here's why is sometimes you jump on these Zoom calls or these, Google Hangout calls or Teams calls or whatever you use. And there's a bunch of, banter or chatter at the beginning. People are asking about the weather or this or that, but no one wants to go back and listen to that shit. So what you want to do is actually maybe clip it to the most relevant points. So what I'll do is if there's 10 or 15 minutes of intros and small talk, I'll clip those first 10 minutes out and get right to the beginning of the presentation or the demo. And I even send these for discovery calls from time to time, especially if it's just a very engaging one where there's a lot of back and forth. So go ahead and send, the meeting recording as a follow-up, as part of your follow-up. So I'll just put it in the follow-up email. By the way, here's a link to the meeting recording from today for your reference. What I've found too is prospects will forward these on to other people that are involved. In some cases, the person that's making the decision at the executive level might get a forwarded email with the link to the meeting recording. So again, make sure you've clipped out any small talk or banter and that you're, that the recording is clean and sounds good and looks good and everything. The other cool thing is most of these tools have a feature where if someone clicks on the link, you get a notification saying, such and such person clicked on it. I had a prospect a few weeks ago, and it was cool because this person must have been forwarding the link around, because I got a whole bunch of notifications from other people at the company who I was aware of, but I hadn't directly connected with, that were watching the video clips that I was sending over. So it just gave me some insights on who I should probably go connect with on LinkedIn, and who else I might need to be thinking about for future steps in the deal cycle. Because one of the contacts that clicked on the link and was watching it was someone in the IT department, which was separate from the department I was working with. So it was just an insight into, okay, it sounds like IT is going to have to get involved in this deal. And, so-and-so is the right person because they're the one who's rewatching, clips that I've sent over to my primary contact. So send it over. You get some really interesting insights on how engaged your prospect is. And then it also shows that initiative and, attention to detail in a way, right? You're showing that you care enough to take time to edit out some of the fluff and send over the presentation or demo, or specific recording, ship that over so they can rewatch it or forward it on to their executive leadership team or their IT team, or, the list goes on and on, right? So send that over, make it part of your follow-ups, make it a routine, and just get into the habit of sharing that so you can get that extra insight and you have that extra credibility of providing that value to the team you're selling to. So tip number 3 is also share your meeting recordings with your internal team. So I'm in a habit as well of sending discovery conversations, demo recordings, and those sorts of things to my manager so he can review those and provide coaching. I send them to my solutions counterpart, who's my sales engineer or technical counterpart. That way, if we have a future demo or a project kickoff or implementation conversation or something along those lines, that individual can prepare as well and have the context of those, early discovery meetings or touch base meetings. So send it around inside your team. Send it to someone you trust who's a counterpart or a peer that you want feedback on the meeting link or on the meeting specifically. Send it to people who are going to help you do the deals. I always say that the more strategic and large the deal is, the more focused on the enterprise it is, the more it becomes a team selling effort. And so if you can use video to streamline that process and get your internal team up to speed on the specific deal, it's going to pay you dividends later on, and it's going to make things easier for everybody to get everybody on the same page. So that's tip number 3, send it around internally. So here's tip number 4. And actually there was a guy that I worked with who was like the Michael Jordan of doing this. He would literally just listen to Gong calls, not his own Gong calls. He would listen to Gong calls for his peers on the team all day. And you could go in Gong specifically, I can't speak for the other tools that I showed earlier, but I know for certain in Gong, you can go in and look at a graph of who listens to the most Gong calls for the company or for your team. And his was always just off the charts. He would literally just have Gong calls running, and he would go way back. He'd go back months or maybe even years on, previous Gong calls that had been recorded. And he was just listening to how other sellers were positioning the product, how they were handling objections, how they were, pitching value and offering value and those sorts of things. So he was using it as a way to sort of train himself on the messaging, and he was a highly successful rep. It was a really, really good practice that I've been trying to adopt as well. It's a little harder in an early startup. If you work in an early company where there's just not a high volume of recorded calls, that can be a little bit more challenging. But even in a startup, you might go back and listen to some of your, peers' calls or the founders' early calls, sales calls that might be valuable. You can listen to your manager's calls that they have that are recorded within these tools and use those to guide your pitch, your approach, your presentation. Ultimately, this is going to help you get better at, positioning your product and pitching your solution. So go check out your peers' calls. It's usually possible. I know for sure in Gong and Chorus you can do this. I can't speak for all the other tools, but I'm pretty certain you can go and at the team level access other calls that have been recorded across the country or across the globe on your sales team. Tip number 5, review your personal and team analytics and get some coaching insights. So again, this one may be more specific to like the Gongs and the Choruses, but they have a pretty robust set of analytics that they capture on every single call. It's really cool. Actually, last year, we interviewed Chris Orlob on Sales Players, and he talked all about how Gong leveraged that data to create a flywheel business, and how that made the product better, but also made, for really good marketing, was showing all the insights that they'd gathered about analyzing, millions of sales calls, right? So I know for sure, Gong and Chorus have the ability to go in and look at some coaching insights or look at some KPIs and things like that. I mentioned it earlier. There's all kinds of things that it's measuring. It's measuring your pause times and how long it takes you to respond to something. It measures, what the ratio is in the call of how much you talk versus how much a prospect talks or speaks. And it's really interesting to look at. And if you're comfortable going in and if you really want to level up and get better at this, it's a really good practice to go in and see where you might be in some risk areas. And again, Gong has like benchmarks within it where you can say, oh, looks like I tend to talk more than my prospect, and maybe I need to bring that down. And, you can kind of coach yourself. But it's also great because I've used it in teams where my manager would review my Gong calls and say, I noticed you didn't say this when you should have. No worries, but let's make sure we do that next time, right? It's, positive feedback on specific calls that I did. That's some of the best coaching you're going to get. And I know for me, it was really helpful to look at the data and say, oh, it looks like I say and too much, or it looks like I wait too long to respond, or maybe I respond too quickly. I think there's a metric for talking over people. And that's something that I think a lot of sellers struggle with, is you accidentally talk over your prospect. So there's a bunch of analytics like that. You can really learn where your gaps are, or where your areas of improvement are by going and using that capability. So go check that out too. Tip number 6, I alluded to this earlier, but just to go into more detail, splicing your recordings down into short form videos and then actually dripping those out to your prospects over a longer time span is a super valuable technique. It's a great way to follow up rather than following up with an email and saying, hey, I'm just checking in. Any word on this? Just following up here. Rather than do that, just send a clip back over. Hey, John, remember in our demo, we talked about this specific capability that you said would have been a game changer for your business. I'm linking to that particular clip here. It's just a minute and a half of us showing that in the demo as just a reminder of how impactful this would be for your team. On that note, what's our next step in the process, right? So it's really good for following up. And then the other thing I've found is when you are doing more complicated deals with lots of stakeholders, lots of decision makers or evaluators that are in the mix, it can be really helpful to have little video clips or micro clips of your meetings, so you can send those over to the new stakeholders that get introduced into the process. Typically in an enterprise deal cycle, you're working with some main point of contact, but at some point, your IT team might have to get involved, your InfoSec team, your security team gets involved, the legal team or the procurement team get involved. In most cases, the exec team gets involved. So as new people get introduced into the project or the deal cycle, it's really helpful to get them up to speed by having ready a few short clips that are outlining value in the product or specific aspects of your product that are relevant to the project and relevant to the team at hand. So splice them down into little recordings. It doesn't take very long. Most of these have a little widget where you can turn these into 1.5 minute videos or 2-minute videos, and then use those as part of your follow-up tactics. And then as you introduce new people into the mix, it makes that process a lot faster and more streamlined. That's number 6. Tip number 7, always review the key meetings for pain, compelling events, company nomenclature, and even body language. This list could go on and on and on, right? It's going back and using these calls as a way to almost slow down time, right? In a deal cycle. Sometimes these move really quickly, but what you can do is you can sort of hack that by having these meeting recordings, going back and watching it. How did people respond to when you delivered pricing, for example? That's always one of my favorite examples is when you put the number up on the screen on your pricing proposal. Did people roll their eyes? Did they look scared? What was their body language when that was happening? What terms and internal speak did they use? I mentioned earlier, like sometimes they call evaluations by a specific project name. Look out for those sorts of things. Maybe they mentioned a specific deadline and you might have missed it in your discovery call, right? Maybe they said, we have to do this by July 1st or else ... right? So listen for those compelling events, company terminology. I also listen for names. I was on a call recently where someone said, oh yeah, so-and-so is going to have to get involved. Jane and John will have to get involved and Steven's going to have to get involved. And I was like, okay, I don't have to write all these down, but I've got these now recorded and I can go back after the meeting and do some research on Sales Navigator and see, who is Steve? Who would Steve be? And that way I can start to map the org out a little bit and build an org chart around my deal. Okay, it sounds like Steve, John, and Jane are all going to be involved at some point. How do I now begin to position myself as someone who can help those people as well? So review your meetings, look out for those signals. A lot of times you'll miss buying signals in the moment because you're so focused on having the conversation with the prospect that you're tuning out some of those signals or you're tuning out some of those clues. So the great thing about recording your meetings is you can go back, re-listen to those, look for those things, search those things in a transcript, or even, again, most of these tools have like an AI feature that can help you sift through things, and that will help you run a more effective meeting in the future. And again, the more you can speak your buyer's language and use their own terminology, their own nomenclature, the more credible you're going to come across to them, the more trustworthy. And honestly, they're going to say, this person listened. They get it. They understand our business. So we're going to select them as the vendor partner for this. That's how this all works. And so that's why I think these meeting recording tools are such a game changer, again, especially for more technical deals, more complicated deals with lots of stakeholders, lots of evaluators that are geared towards, mid-market or enterprise companies. So that's it. That's the presentation for today. I hope this helps somebody out there. Again, if you don't have a tool like this in place, I highly recommend Fathom. They're a partner to the podcast, and I'll link in the show notes to go get your license for Fathom. But if you're using one of these other tools, they're all super robust. They've got a ton of functionality. And again, I've used all of them. For the most part, they all have value and they all have the ability to do the things I've talked about here. But these are the tips and hope you enjoyed. Thanks for tuning in.